Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing the game between the Sharks and the Golden Knights, in which the Sharks managed to win 2-1 in overtime. And I'm sure I speak for every Sharks fan when I say victories against the Golden Knights feel just that much better than regular old victories, just considering the history that these two teams have together. And one small thing I want to point out before we get into the game, this is actually the first time, I believe, in the history of this Sharks-Golden Knights matchup, over 20 games played between these two teams at this point, where the Golden Knights didn't have William Karlsson, Riley Smith, and Jonathan Marchessault together as a line. These three players were separated here tonight. I don't know how often the Golden Knights have done this season, but it is the first time we've seen this from a Sharks perspective, so I just found that a bit interesting. But this game starts off in the first period. It's mostly controlled by the Golden Knights, but it's the Sharks who actually get a puck into the back of the net for the first time in this game, and that was Antti Suomela. However, it ended up getting challenged for goalie interference and getting called back. Not really a huge surprise that the Sharks actually end up losing a coach's challenge in this situation, considering their history this season. I also wasn't all that torn up about it. I was a bit upset in the moment, but I also thought about if the shoe was on the other foot and this was Jones, or I guess Dell in this case, getting interfered with like this, I would have probably been pretty pissed if the goal did stand. And so in this case, I wasn't too mad, especially since the Sharks did end up winning. So the score was 0-0 at the end of the first. It would be Timo Meier striking early in the second period, as considering the Sharks draft ran with 7 defensemen here tonight, it was Timo Meier who actually got a lot of the double shifts with Suomela and Gambrell, and he actually ended up getting his goal with Suomela on the ice, so that was nice to see. It would eventually be Braden McNabb tying it up at around the midpoint of the third period, and there would be no other offense before Logan Couture would end it in the overtime. So the Sharks, after having got pretty much embarrassed by the Buffalo Sabres in their first overtime this season, they have looked a lot better since then, or at least have been getting the wins since then. First thing to talk about would be Aaron Dell. I was surprised to see Dell in nets here. I said even though Jones did lose that game against the Oilers, since it was against the Golden Knights, that likely they would go with their starter. And of course Dell, who plays basically every game against the Islanders, I thought he would get the game on Saturday. But instead Dell starts here tonight, and he was very, very good. Dell made a lot of good saves. I do have to give a lot of credit to the Sharks defense through the first 60 minutes. They actually managed to do a pretty good job, but Dell did have to make, in particular, one huge save in the first period. And of course, in the overtime, where the Sharks sort of played a bit more of a run-and-gun style and allowed a lot of defensive chances, he made 3 straight insane level saves. It reminded me a lot of the saves Jones had to make in the overtime against the Detroit Red Wings, that one when he was short-handed. And so both Jones and Dell coming up huge in overtimes for the Sharks and getting their team the extra point. And so a great game from Aaron Dell, and I wouldn't be all too surprised, especially since he does get games against the Islanders, as I said, I wouldn't be too surprised to see Dell actually get another start here in a row on Saturday. But then again, I also wouldn't be too surprised to see DeBoer go back to his starter. It's going to be a very difficult choice after the game Dell just put up. Next, I'll talk about Couture, the captain. It's pretty long overdue that I talk about this player. I had mentioned Couture back in the Vancouver Canucks loss, saying that Couture needed to step up and have a big game like we've seen him do in the playoffs. And he didn't actually do that in the game after against the Blackhawks, but he did then have 4 points in the game after that against the Minnesota Wild. He has then since been mostly on fire. I think now we're like, 12 or 13 points here in these last few games. He's been very, very good for the San Jose Sharks, and considering Tomas Hertl was out with an injury this game, he did need to step up, and while it wasn't super apparent in the 60 minutes, it was nice to see him get the overtime goal. As I said, sort of overdue me talking about him. Next, I will mention Radim Simek. Sort of two sides here at this point. In the first side is Simek having played a pretty solid game in this one. He has struggled as of late. In the past few games, he hasn't been all that good, but it was nice to see him back on top of his game. He actually bailed out Brent Burns a couple of times on some pretty bad defensive plays. Simek was able to recover and prevent any sort of good opportunity from coming of that. But the other side of the coin here is that Simek actually only played about 12 minutes here tonight. I don't believe he got any shifts near the end of the third period in the last 7, 8, 10 minutes of the third period, so could be a bit worrying. Of course, Simek is probably the major player who we would have to really watch in terms of potential injuries flaring up, considering his history here with the injuries. He missed about 9 months, I guess, over the offseason with that ACL, MCL, whatever type of injury. And so hopefully it's not related to his knee. Hopefully it's just a few bumps and bruises and he can get back into the lineup, because we see just how key Radim Simek is for this team now. I believe, 7-1 since his return, the only loss being against the Oilers the other night. Finally, I will mention the Sharks' depth. So, of course, as I said, Tomas Hertl did not get to play this game. And so when the Sharks do have Tomas Hertl into the lineup, they are able to sort of field a pretty solid top three lines. That would be Kane, Couture, Labanc, which is a solid first line. Meier, Gaudreau, and Hertl, pretty solid second line, or very solid second line. And then Thornton, Marleau, and Sorensen, a solid third line. But once one of those top players like Hertl does go out, the Sharks' paper-thin depth does begin to fall apart a bit. Meier, Gaudreau, and Marleau is not that great of a second line anymore. Karlsson, Thornton, and Sorensen pretty average for a third line, so it was a bit of an issue, and you could tell that one tonight. The Sharks didn't get too much offense generated, and they only had the single goal actually stick from Timo Meier, but they did find a way to win. We know Tomas Hertl's injury isn't too serious, isn't too long-term, so hopefully he'll actually be back for the next game on Saturday. At that point, maybe the Sharks' depth issues can continue to be masked, sort of. We saw Suomela actually come into this game on the fourth line. He was okay. Of course, he did get that goal that ended up getting called back. I always felt like Suomela got a bit of the short end of the stick from De Boer, sort of ended up in the doghouse maybe a bit too early, but he hasn't been that great in the Barracuda, or at least he wasn't last season. He's been a bit better this season, so he gets the call up. I wouldn't be too surprised to see him get another game here, but we'll see what happens with Tomas Hertl. Also, should mention, as I said, 7 defensemen playing here tonight. We saw actually this helped mitigate some of the ice times in this game. We saw Erik Karlsson still pretty high with 25 minutes, but Brent Burns actually surprisingly only getting about 21. Going back, however, as a final point here to the forward depth, I said that the Sharks had some pretty paper thin without Tomas Hertl, and if you take a look at the ice times, it really does show, where you have a player like Evander Kane over 24 minutes here tonight. Couture, Labanc, and Meier were all over 20 minutes, and I do realize this game did have about 3.5 minutes of overtime, so it's possible players like Meier, Couture, and Labanc wouldn't have been over 20 minutes, but Evander Kane certainly would have, and so it's not something that's really a long-term plan. So Hertl coming back will be a very, very good thing, but hopefully there are no real long-term injuries that the Sharks have to deal with this season on forward side, because it could be a problem if that does occur. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action on Saturday. They will face off against the New York Islanders. I don't believe the Islanders have a game tomorrow, and so they will be facing off against the Sharks, coming in with a 16-game point streak. They are 15-0-1 in their last 16 games. So if there was a tough match this season for the Sharks, it would be on Saturday. We'll see who gets the start between Dylan Jones, and the Sharks will certainly have to bring their A game, and the Sharks will certainly need Tomas Hertl to come back for that one if they want any sort of chance of knocking the Islanders off this pedestal that they're on. Class dismissed.